Hello, everyone. This is the 109th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle of the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview American author Mr. Hal Phillips as we discuss his book, Generation Zero: Founding Fathers, Hidden Histories, and the Making of Soccer in America. This book chronicles the journey and the background of the USA squad that qualified to the 1990 World Cup after a 40-year absence. Welcome, Hal.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into soccer?
My trajectory into soccer. Well, like the principals, the characters in this book, I really didn't play soccer until about 1973 when I was about 8 years old. We moved to Greater Boston and I had no knowledge of the game. But when I arrived there, I was swept up in the youth soccer revolution. There were already leagues in place, and I started to get involved and played all my growing up. And we had a very good club team. Same guy, the kids were together for about 10 years and we won a bunch of state championships. We won a high school state championship. So we had some success, which makes it easy to love a sport. I played D3 in college. And then after that, I played semi-pro in the Urban Ethnic Luso-American Soccer Association, which was sort of your typical urban ethnic league, but Portuguese run in Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And then I moved to Maine in 1992 for work and played in the Open League here for about 10 years. And until my hamstrings said, you can't do that anymore. So I stopped at 40. I really didn't. I'm a journalist by trade, and I've written some pieces for ESPN.com about Fulham and other soccer matters, but I work in the golf business, basically. I'm a sports writer by trade, a journalist by training. And when I wrote this book, when I published it in 2022, it was the culmination of about a 5 or 6 year process that might not have been finished if it weren't for the pandemic. So thanks for that, pandemic. And that's really my entree into soccer proper. I played it all my life. I've been a fan all my life. And now I'm writing about it professionally.
Let's get started with the central premise of your book. You call the generation of American players that qualified to the 1990 World Cup as Generation Zero, the reference point for what modern American soccer is today. Can you explain to younger fans the significance of this generation's achievement?
I think, as everyone knows, soccer was played in this country for a century before the 1970s and 80s, and it never really amounted to much. Generation Zero is the story of, the cohort of American players and fans that finally mainstreamed the sport. Generation Zero is, I guess, a play on Patient Zero. You can't get any further back than that. They're the first generation that really mattered. Soccer didn't ignite until 1989 when we qualified for the Italian World Cup. I think we can also agree on that. And it didn't ignite in the 1970s when NASL was happening. But it took a generation of players about 20 years to actually make all this happen. 1989, 1994, MLS launching in 1996, the U.S. women's national team winning the World Cup in 1991. These are all members of the same cohort. They're all Gen Xers. They were all born in the 1960s, and they were all raised on soccer as soccer natives, our first generation of soccer natives in this country in the 1970s. So, those kids from the youth soccer generation, they played in the 70s like I did. They were introduced to the game then, most of them. And it took 20 years for them to grow up and make all these things happen. I'd never seen that book, that story written before. So that's what I intended to do with Generation Zero. The other thing, I guess, that it's important to realize is that, it took 20 years to raise up this elite cohort of players that qualified for Italy, that won the World Cup in 1991, that hosted 94 with such success, that launched Major League Soccer in 1996. But you can think about all the people, who grew up with these people. They also played, these mere mortals, youth soccer in the 1970s. They didn't play in college, maybe. They probably didn't go pro. They didn't do anything much with the game, but they grew up with it the way we grow up with sports in this country. Like little leaguers, they have an understanding of the game. So when 94 came around and the World Cup was held here, we filled those stadiums at a record pace. Who did that? Well, that was Generation X. It was Generation Zero. It was all those people that grew up with soccer. They're the first cohort of Americans to do so. They were able to support Major League Soccer because they knew the game, the first generation to do so.
Can you discuss your research process for this book, the duration to write it, and some of the people you were able to interview for your book?
There's a significant portion of memoir in the book, and I wrote that down when I stopped playing soccer in about 2004, because I was afraid I'd forget all the stuff that I did. I played, for 30 years. Some of that made it into the book, but around 2010, 2012, I sort of picked my head up and said, wow, everyone kept talking about how soccer hadn't made it in America or it was going to make it and it was just a matter of time. I think around 2010 through 2012, I said to myself, I think it has made it. It's on TV all over the place. Major League Soccer is finally worth watching. It took quite a while, frankly, for that to be true. People started talking about how America was one of the best places to watch soccer in the world. You could watch more soccer here than you could almost any country on earth. So I was like, how did this happen? When did this happen? And that's when I started talking to people about this and this transformation that I think had crept up on me, and I think crept up on a lot of people because no one's really written about it since. I talked to about a dozen guys on the 1990 U.S. men's national team. I really do focus on them as the avatars for this movement. They are exactly my age. They were all born in the 60s, raised on the game in the 70s. And I really point to the 1990 World Cup qualification as the turning point. When the sport started to mainstream itself, 94 did what it did, but 1990 predicated everything that came after it. I talked to Bob Gansler, the coach of that team, a host of other coaches from that era. I talked to a bunch of media who reported through that era, folks like Mike Watala at Soccer America, academics like Dr. Andre Markovits, who wrote Offside, History of Soccer and American Exceptionalism, which was a very helpful book. I'm a journalist by trade, so I combed through the written record of everything that had been written down about this period, in periodicals, magazines like Soccer America and a bunch of regional magazines that are no longer with us, but things like the NASL Kick magazine and the Soccer Journal, which was published by the Federation for a while. But, the New York Times and the Guardian, there's quite a good written record of all the stuff that went on in the 70s and the 80s, because I really wanted to track this period. If you're going to argue that 1989 was the turning point, well, what produced those people? What produced this cohort of players and fans and, frankly, coaches? So it's the why of all that happened in the 70s and 80s that no one had really written about. I thought that was important to get down on the record and to provide a timeline, because the story does fit together and make sense when you know the history.
Now, as you mentioned, this generation, they were all born in the early to mid 1960s. They witnessed and were inspired by the old North American Soccer League, NASL, but also had to deal with the ramifications of its collapse to their own ambitions and careers. Can you explain the importance of the NASL in their psyche and development?
I like the way you put that, because it is uniquely important in that way. But I think then when we step back and look at the North American Soccer League, we have to recognize that, the league wasn't aimed at Generation Zero. It was aimed at baby boomers. I think they saw this massive cohort of consumers that were non-traditional and said, well, this is the time to start proper soccer league in this country, and it's going to make us all rich. Now, as it turned out, the boomers took a U-turn and basically became very traditional in their sports watching habits in the 1970s. All the major sports that already existed grew and expanded their viewership. Soccer tried to latch onto that with the North American Soccer League. So its legacy is complicated by that fact. The baby boomers were supposed to love NASL, and they really didn't give a damn about it. It was the kids who took a shine to it. People like me, people like Bruce Murray, whose dad, his coach played for the Diplomats. And everybody that I spoke to, all the dozen players that I spoke to, they all loved NASL in the same way. They saw men playing the game that they loved. That's a really big part of sports fandom when you're a kid. They also saw other people paying attention, and they had aspirations to grow up and do this themselves, just like kids with, I'm going to grow up and be a baseball player. I've seen them on TV. So it was really important in that way. But NASL did what it was supposed to do in a very limited way. I did a piece for the Howler magazine after the publication of this book when I talked to Chris Barr, the brother of Matt and Chris Barr, who played in, NASL and also kicked in the NFL. The son of Walter Barr, had 3 sons, and Chris was the oldest one. And he grew up really in the 60s. And he didn't start playing soccer until he got to high school. He ended up playing in NASL, but it was terrible in the early 70s. It really was no good. His 2 younger brothers, 5 or 6 years younger than he was, they had leagues to play in. And when they grew up, they were much better. And also NASL was better. So they had a completely different experience relating to it as players. And the window for NASL being really a viable entity were the Pele years in the middle of the 70s. Once he was gone, it stopped drawing people. The TV contract went away very quickly. The aspirational qualities of this league became very limited. The league was created to make money. It didn't do that. But it was also created to be this aspirational force for soccer in America. And it did that, especially for the kids who followed the franchises in their regions. But it was also designed to create American soccer players and be a developmental force for them. And it did a terrible job of that. And in fact, it was counterproductive because there was a quota in the NASL. I think people probably have an understanding of that. You had to have 2 Americans on the field, 2 North Americans on the field at all times. And I guess that's good. Maybe they wouldn't have been able to make the team otherwise or play. But what happens? Where do you put them? They put them in goal. They put them at left back. Those people never played in the middle of the field. So we didn't develop any creative players for our national team. We created a bunch of guys who could play goalie and outside back and maybe a winger or 2. So when it came to the U.S. men's national team, the USMNT, the 70s and 80s were some of the worst ones that we experienced as a nation. They were really terrible. They were the years when you would have thought NASL would have really meant something. So the question was, how did it affect the psyche of Generation Zero? They loved NASL. They loved individual players. They loved the Americans who played. They loved the fact that Cruyff and the late, great Franz Beckenbauer and Pele were right here playing in front of us. And I had the same exact reaction. But they were very disillusioned with the fact that this league wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. Number one, it failed. It was gone by 1984. That was a bummer. And they had no place to go play professional soccer in this country when it did fail. And, oh, by the way, the American Soccer League, the 2nd division of professional soccer in this country, folded in 1983. So I think they felt a little betrayed by the whole exercise. I mean, that against their better judgment, because I think there's romance in NASL. I love looking at these Facebook pages, these NASL, this nostalgia pages. They're fabulous. I love the pictures, and there really is a lot of love for the league and these teams and these players. But if you are an elite soccer player growing up in the 1970s and 80s, you're destroyed by the fact that, well, this was your plan. No one went abroad in 1984. All these guys were going to go and play in NASL. So they couldn't do any of that. They had to go to plan B, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
So you mentioned how the baby boomers were in general disinterested in the sport. Same with the media. Can you paint a picture of soccer's place in American culture around this time in the 1970s?
I think youth soccer was a revelation to them, and the way kids are very, sheltered and living in a little bubble. They probably thought that soccer was just taking off everywhere because everyone could play on a team now when they couldn't. Their older brothers and sisters, they didn't exist. These youth leagues in the 60s, most of them sprouted in the 70s. So on the youth soccer level, I think it's hard to argue with the soccer culture in America. It was enormous and grew like a weed. I mean, it had 50 state coverage too. There were soccer leagues that started in every state in the union. No one's ever put a number to how many kids actually took part, but it was a lot. And if you were a kid, I think you thought it was obviously the next best thing. But in every other respect, I mean, soccer in America and its growth was sort of superficial. NASL was painted as a success. Pele got the league on TV, but as soon as Pele left, the bottom fell out of the entire league. The TV, they basically, ABC basically said, yeah, we have a 2-year contract, but we're ending after this year. I think that was 1980. The New England T-Men, they were my team. They moved all over the place, but I think they played one of the last games in Foxborough Stadium in 1980, and I think 328 people showed up. I mean, this was happening all over the country. They had a lot of franchises. By the end, they were down to 14 when it folded. So, and there was no upgrade in the quality of the U.S. national team at this time. They went from, bad to worse. And this was one of the really interesting things was I really wanted to talk to the players on the 1989 national team about, what did you think of those guys who were a generation ahead of you? They paid very much attention to them as players in NASL, but also as members of this national team that Generation Zero aspired to play on as well. I kept on trying to say, why didn't they do better? I mean, or what was your impression? Why didn't this team succeed? Why couldn't they qualify for the 86 World Cup in Mexico? They actually said to me, yeah, that's really weird. We sort of, that team should have done much better. I mean, they were all in NASL. They all thought that NASL on some level would have helped that team advance, the U.S. national team. It never did. And I think the harsh reality is it really was detrimental to U.S. soccer fortunes in many, many ways. We talked about the talent issue in the middle of the field. NASL just never helped Americans become central creative players. And when it started dying, where did all those American pros go? Well, they went indoors where their skills are even less applicable to U.S. men's national team outdoor soccer World Cup qualification. So, if you look at the contemporary cultural penetration of soccer, once Pele left, it was very low. And when the league folded, it was zero. There was a lot of pushback against soccer during this period too, which, if you were there at the time, which I was, I'm 59 years old, born in 1964. I was in college in 1984 when it folded. There was a lot of, I don't know what you would call it, but sports writers, and I know these folks pretty well because I am one. These old guys, cigar chomping old men in bad sport coats, they really hated soccer because it was an interloper. They saw it as a foreign sport. Well, when NASL folded, they couldn't have been happier. I mean, I think there was that element in the culture as well. I lived through it. And, I document that cynicism and that xenophobic attitude in the book. It's part of soccer's story in this country, for better or for worse.
Right. It's a boring sport, etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You know what this game needs is more goals, And
Yeah.
and look, those criticisms are stupid, but they exist. And in the mid 80s, when NASL folded, ASL folded, and the US missed out on qualifying for this World Cup right next door. I mean, that would have been another massive opportunity to sell the game to the populace. When that went by the wayside, if they bothered to note it at all, soccer was derided for it. So the American soccer culture in the 70s was, I think, quite bright. People thought we would go from strength to strength because that's what Americans do. And in the 80s, it just got worse. And so the idea that this 89 team emerged from this culture of soccer failure is even more remarkable.
You also point out how for this generation, there was a dearth of proper coaching at youth level, detection at youth level. There was no proper academy system. Can you explain how this generation would have dealt with that?
Well, let's pin it down. Who was going to coach your youth soccer league in 1975?
Well,
Someone's dad. The parents do. And, they want their kids to have a good time. And, my dad coached and he didn't know what he was doing. A lot of these guys didn't know what they were doing. So that was a problem. So there are no academies, of course, because NASL didn't commit itself to developing players in the real way. They should have. I should go back. NASL was run by Europeans who come from a culture where academies are attached to clubs. Well, there wasn't a single NASL club that had an academy. So they should have known better. They should have devoted some resources to that, but they were just trying to keep the lights on. They didn't spend money on that. But in terms of the coaching, youth soccer You have dads coaching, and there are some dads who know what they're doing. First or second generation immigrants know what they're doing, maybe, and they make a big difference. And I'll come back to that. But high school coaching, terrible. I mean, who's going to do it? The sport has been around for 100 years. No one really played it as a kid. They pick it up because they're going to get paid a stipend, by the high school. So like, yeah, I'll coach some soccer. It's a little more money. My high school coach didn't play soccer or know anything about soccer when he started coaching the JV in 1969 when varsity soccer was instituted at my high school. So there was no high school soccer in my town, which was a big soccer town in 1979. 10 years prior, it didn't exist. So there were thousands of coaches like that. They're not going to teach anybody any appreciable skills. The really important development in the 70s was that the Olympic Development Program launched in 1978. And I think this was sort of a Cold War development. We were worried about the Soviets getting ahead of us in Olympic sports, and there were resources thrown at it. And the Olympic Soccer Development Program was basically a talent identification program that was nationwide, all 50 states, funnel good players into, a regional sort of all-star team that where you could actually get them some good coaching. It was all about coaching. There were only a handful of them, good coaches, proper international standard coaches in the country. We have to pick the talented kids out and get them in front of these guys at the earliest point possible. Now, that meant when they were 15 or 16 years old at the earliest. So it's not ideal. Academies identify kids who are 10 and 12. We know that today. But at the time, when it launched in 1978, nothing existed that would identify these kids and pool them together on state teams and regional teams where they could get the coaching. So that was a really big development. In 1968, that didn't work. That didn't exist. And our national team was terrible. In 1958, it was even further away. So baby steps. But by the time Generation Zero comes through that system, every single one of them played Olympic development soccer. So when they were 15, 16 years old playing for terrible high school coaches in their hometown, they're getting actual coaching from the U.S. Federation via the Olympic Development Program. So there was you do what you can. I mean, the academy system didn't start influencing the way U.S. players were groomed until the 2000s. I don't think MLS had academies attached to the franchises until 2007, 8, 9. So that's a long time from 1978. So the Olympic Development Program was the best game in town for a long time. And I think we can look at the men's national team today and say, well, that's the reason we have such a deep roster of talent at the senior level in 2024. All those kids were raised by academies in MLS and overseas. And the women better get on board fast because the Europeans invented this system. They know how to do this better than anybody in the world. Youth soccer clubs and college teams can't train up talented women in the same way that Barcelona and Lyon can. So they better go with the program, or they've probably already been caught and passed, but NWSL needs some academies.
As we get into the early 1980s, there's still some institutional barriers that limit progress of American players. Can you discuss some of these?
Well, we just talked about a big one. One of the things that I think, there were no academies. So kids were expected to follow the American pattern for athletes. And Americans think they turn out the best athletes in the world. And I think an argument can be made that that's true. But what does that mean? That means you go to high school and play baseball, basketball, and football in high school. Then you go and play in college, and then you go and play pro. Well, that system doesn't work in soccer because you're not going to turn out players good enough to even qualify for a World Cup. We've seen that in action. So that mentality worked against us. And that explained why every single member of the 1989 men's national team played college soccer. I mean, that was just the way it worked. And we really didn't think it was that weird that we did that because all the great football and basketball players did that. Well, why wouldn't this work for soccer? Well, you can't develop international standard players. I guess that's it. Soccer is an international game, whereas American football and basketball and baseball, they're all domestic competitions. We're not competing against the world and in those sports. We're just competing against ourselves. So we don't have to develop international standard players. We're just developing players that are good enough to play in college. And that's basically what they were. But, somewhere in the 1980s, they figured out that it's really not helping us that our best players are playing college soccer 4 months out of 12. So that was a problem. No academies, high school and soccer playing only a few 4 months out of 12. And this idea that, well, this is the way we produce athletes in this country. Jack Armstrong, and they're going to go on and win the Olympic decathlon. It's got to work. It's got to work. Well, it never really did work. We got lucky with 1989 for a variety of reasons that we'll surely get into. But yeah, the academy system was the big one, but there were other cultural factors that held us back.
In the early 1980s, to prepare for the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, it necessitated to create an NASL team called Team America.
Mhm.
Can you describe this whole concept to anyone who might not know about it?
Well, it's a great chapter in the history of U.S. soccer. People do like talking about it because it's just so strange. In 1984, you know how many coaches the Federation employed in 1984?
Yeah.
3. There was a fellow, Angus McAlpine, who coached the under-20s. There was Alexis Panagoulis, who coached the senior national team. And then there was a guy named Manfred Schelscheit, who coached an amateur group of players, including several guys on the 1989 U.S. men's national team who would go on to do that. They were all amateurs. And his job was to prepare these guys for the 1984 Olympics, which we were hosting and qualified for automatically, and we didn't want to embarrass ourselves. At this time, the U.S. Federation is also trying to get the 1986 World Cup because Colombia backed out. It eventually went to Mexico, but there was, trying to organize the Federation to do some things. Well, at some point, the International Olympic Committee says, you know what, we're going to let professionals play in the Olympics. So they ended up firing Schelscheit and putting Panagoulis in charge of the U.S. national team. And at the same time, they said, hey, why don't we just put this men's national team together as a unit into NASL, which was teetering on the edge of collapse at that point. They could do whatever they wanted because no one was going to these games anyway. But at least we're going to get our team ready for the Olympics and create an actual unit and address some of the issues that NASL had. If it's all Americans, someone has to play center midfield who's American on Team America. On Team America, your center forward is going to be an American. He's going to get a chance to play in the middle of the field. They already saw what the problem was and tried to address it. So that's what they did. They picked the best players they could, and they put them into NASL, and they put them under the U.S. national team coach. He was going to coach them at the Olympics, and then the next year they would try to qualify for the Mexican World Cup. So it wasn't as crazy as it sounds back then. Eastern European countries had developed this habit of putting amateur teams in professional leagues, and hockey, for example, not maybe the top division, but in the lower division. It's a developmental thing. So they figured, why not put this group of young pros together in NASL to prep for the Olympics? So, federations do unorthodox things when they preside over developing soccer nations. And this was a developing soccer nation in 1983. So it didn't go as well as it could have. They started out pretty well. I think they were 8-5 at some point, but then they lost 13 or 14 games to close the season. And they basically disbanded it because this was basically the winter between 83 and 84, and the league would fold in October 1984. So they really had no money or patience for developmental initiatives like Team America. And it's a shame because I think it was a good idea. It would have gotten Americans playing together all the time and playing in the middle of the field under the national team coach. How can that be a bad thing to prep for tournament play? But it lasted only one season, and then it was over. But, it's sort of picked on by, I think, soccer intelligentsia because it was so weird and it did fail. But I think the idea was sound. And if they had done it in 1980, I think our national team in 1985 would have been a lot more viable. But they didn't have that idea, and NASL was not that desperate at that point. But interesting chapter in the life of a second world soccer country.
Can you get into the collapse of the NASL in 1984-85 and its immediate effect on this generation?
Well, they had no place to play professional soccer. So the place that they had geared their entire careers around and toward was gone. And so was the ASL, the second division. So that was the major thing. These guys were all very young. If you're born in 1964, 65, 66, in 1984, you're only 19 or 20 years old. So a lot of them just went off to college, which maybe they were planning to do anyway. I know, I think Tab Ramos said that he was going to spend a year at NC State and then go and play for the Cosmos, who had his regional rights. Well, when the Cosmos folded, he just stayed at NC State. Bruce Murray was already at Clemson, and so he just stayed there. So college soccer took on a far bigger importance, in their career plan, because NASL was not there to accommodate them. So that's pretty huge. I think that it's sort of hard to gloss over the fact that all the guys who played in NASL, all the Americans, they were in their 20s, in their sporting primes, and they are unemployed, and they had families. Their career is now in the dumper. So it really affected their lifestyle and their careers far more markedly than this younger group that could still go to college and wait for something better to come along. I call them in the book, I call this the Ricky Davis NASL cohort. They had also geared their careers around playing in NASL. And when it was gone, they went and played indoor in the major indoor soccer league because they needed to pay the bills. And that was the only professional brand of soccer available in this country for 4 long years. But, bringing it back around to international play, this is one reason the men's national team in 1980 and 1984 during the Olympics, and then in 1985 trying to qualify for Mexico 86, all these guys were playing indoor, and they just couldn't, nobody, I don't think, can be expected to play all season and all winter on an indoor team and then jump onto an outdoor field and be any good when it's time to qualify for a World Cup. And as it happens, we couldn't even get out of the preliminary round of that World Cup qualifying in 1985. We were in a group with Costa Rica and Trinidad and Tobago. We actually beat Trinidad and Tobago twice and went to Costa Rica and earned a tie. It looked like we had it in the bag. All we needed to do was tie against Costa Rica. They ended up losing at home in Torrance, California. It's one of the great failures in American soccer history. And bang, they couldn't even go on and qualify for final qualifying. So it affected them terribly. But I think it also eventually proved how bad NASL truly was at creating professionals, especially in the middle of the field and skill positions. But, NASL's disappearance didn't mean that all of Generation Zero had no place to go. They went to college, they played in the urban ethnic leagues, and it also was an impetus to explore the idea of playing overseas. Although when you're 19 and you have never played professionally, the idea that, I'm going to go and give it a shot in France, that just did not occur to anybody until they were a little older, a little more seasoned, because that's just asking too much. I mean, and so they made the best of it. They played college soccer and they played in the urban ethnic leagues with me. And, if I'm playing with the best guys on the national team, there's something wrong. That it's just not the way it's supposed to work. But, I think closing, NASL's departure closed the book on so many entire generation of professional players. They all went indoors, and it effectively dropped the entire U.S. men's national team program into the laps of these young guys born in the 60s, raised on soccer in the 70s. All of a sudden, they're untouched and unsullied by the NASL experience. And Werner Fricker, who had taken over the federation in 1984, decides, you know what? We're just going to bring these guys together. I don't care how young they are. And they're going to be the national team, and we're going to keep them together for 3 years and take our chances.
Now, you spent some time discussing the 1985 World Cup qualifiers in May.
Mm-hmm.
And you most particularly discussed the critical loss to Costa Rica on May 31st. You call that as another reference point of sorts. Can you get more into that?
Well, it was the nadir. It was the low point. It was rock bottom. I think they played a friendly against England later that summer and got beaten 5-0. Maybe that was the bottom of the barrel, but you can't get much lower than that. That was really interesting period to report out in the book. I learned some great stuff, like Trinidad and Tobago. Really, they didn't have a bad team, but we beat them twice. But I noticed that we played them twice at home, and I'm like, what? How's that possible? Well, it turns out that Jack Warner, who would go on to break new ground in soccer corruption circles at CONCACAF and FIFA, he sold the U.S. Federation TNT's home qualifier for $40,000, and he sold the home qualifier against Costa Rica as well. So poor TNT didn't play a single home game in this preliminary, and because Jack Warner lined his own pockets. It was the end. It was the end of NASL. It was the end of the players that were produced by NASL. It was the beginning of Werner Fricker's Federation tenure, and it was in 1984-85, all these guys that we're talking about who started out in the youth soccer revolution and came up through the substandard high school and college system, they're now 19 and 20, 21 years old. And this is where they get their reputation for being a bunch of college kids. Well, they were in 1985 and 6. They were all in college. And they would show up for camps and play for Lothar Osiander, who was, like Fricker, a German immigrant. And Osiander whipped them into shape and actually produced from that very young side a very capable young national team that no one knew anything about. I don't know how many Americans really even knew that we had a national soccer team in 1985 and 6, but it was these guys, and it was the beginning of their growth, and it was the beginning of the modern American soccer story. But you would never have guessed it at the time because it was the lowest point in American soccer.
I can attest to that. I came to America in August of 1985. The game was non-existent here.
Yes.
You wouldn't even know it if it existed. You know my background. I came from football countries, lived in football countries, and you come here and it's nothing. And this is exactly the post NASL and the post this 1985 World Cup qualifiers era. It is truly the bleakest time in that I can remember with memory. American
Absolutely.
soccer.
It's absolutely true. Let's put it in context, though. So before NASL was formed in 1967 and 8, the highest sort of level of soccer in America was played by these urban ethnic clubs in urban centers all over the country, competing in regional leagues with semi-professional players, some of whom were first-generation immigrants, maybe second-generation immigrants. They learned the game elsewhere, or they grew up in a place like St. Louis or Milwaukee, surrounded by people who knew the game. Kearney, New Jersey, another example of a place that's dominated by the Scotch-Irish, who, if the dads and granddads didn't grow up in Scotland, they came over and coached those teams. So those kids had some understanding. And these urban ethnic clubs, these were the best players in the best, most competitive leagues in America. Now, they weren't national. They were all regional clubs, and their big tournaments were like the National Amateur Cup conducted by the U.S. Soccer Federation and the Open Cup, which included anybody, professional or otherwise. So that was the top of the pyramid in 1966. Then NASL comes in, and they take all the good players, and they bring in a bunch of other high class players from abroad, and they're trying to develop these young American players. And that was obviously the best soccer in America. And these urban ethnic, leagues really suffered. I mean, NASL took all the resources, all the attention, what little there was, away. Then NASL folds, and the ASL folds. All of a sudden, the urban ethnic clubs and that model of regional volunteer-run clubs coached by people who know the game but aren't being paid for it, all of a sudden, this is the best soccer being played in North America. This was the soccer that I played in the Lhasa League. They played in the Cosmopolitan Super League in New York, in the Hungarian-German League in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in San Francisco, in LA. Of course, there's 3 or 4 huge leagues in Southern California. This is the best soccer being played in America. And if you're 19 years old and you're Peter Vermees and you want to play soccer, yeah, I'm playing at Rutgers for 4 months a year. What do? Well, I go play with the Greeks in New York the other 8 months of the year. Every single player on the U.S. men's national team, 1987, 88, 89, they all played in these urban ethnic leagues. They got money for it. They played with classy players who maybe were 30, 35 years old, but still knew what they were doing. They learned from them. They got good coaching. They got decent coaching, I should say. Almost everyone I spoke to said they really were developed as players. They were made as players by those leagues, making a few $100 per game. And here's the thing about urban ethnic soccer, you only get paid when you win. So it was a very transactional thing. They would be brought in as ringers sometimes, or they would be laboring on a team like Brooklyn Italians and the Super League in New York, full of ex-NASL players, very good. And Mike Windishman says flat out, he goes, that's the best soccer I played until, I went to the World Cup. I mean, it's like you'd ask me whether or not the Brooklyn Italians could go and beat Costa Rica in a qualifier. They would beat Costa Rica. It was very good soccer. So, yeah, it was a very dark time. You remember correctly. I lived through it myself. But there was this sort of invisible soccer ferment that did exist in this country. Because when you're in a country of 300, 250 million people, and you have these pockets of soccer influence and ferment, there might have been 25, 30 million soccer fans in this country. But do they show up on a Nielsen rating? No. Do they congeal in some way so that Coke can sell advertising to one of those league games and think it'd be worth their while? No. So it was diffuse. And, that's why you have leagues, to bring it together and make it national and make more money and sell that product, that content to ESPN. But we just weren't there yet. But it was a weird period where the soccer was actually okay, but it was just not the NASL or anything that we would have recognized as professional.
Werner Fricker is elected as USSF president in 1984. And following that, the first, ray of sunlight is the 1980 Olympics, most particularly the 1987 qualifiers against Canada, which are also another reference point for this generation.
Well, let's back up a little bit. I think that the 1984 Olympics were a really important tournament for us. Not because we played particularly well. They didn't play bad. I think they went 1-1-1, and did not advance to the knockout rounds. But they didn't embarrass themselves. That's number one. And this was the team of NASL, the Davis NASL cohort that ended up losing a year later to Costa Rica and failing to qualify for the World Cup. They didn't play terrible. What the American soccer culture did produce was massive crowds. I mean, they filled the Rose Bowl for group games. They filled Stanford Stadium, 70,000 people for group games. And FIFA was like, oh my God. They weren't expecting that at all. And I think that was really important, because I think there's no way we get the World Cup in 1994 if the 1984 Olympic tournament didn't happen and didn't turn out so many people at those stadia. And all those people weren't, urban ethnic folks. There were a lot of young Generation Zero people who were raised on soccer in the 70s who went to those games and made it a success. But Werner Fricker changed the game. He understood that we had to have a national league, and they did relaunch league soccer in America in 1988, but 4 years is a long time. But he was the one who tried to get the U.S. The World Cup in 1986, didn't get it, but second time was a charm. 4 years later, in 1988, he was the one who spearheaded the effort to win that tournament award from FIFA. He started the women's soccer, national team program in 1985, and he took a big chance. He hired Lothar Osiander, and he said, you're going to coach these 19 and 20-year-old college kids, and that's the national team. No one else was doing this. That's a big, big step. And he said, we have no choice. We're not going to go with the old guys. We're going to go with the young guys. And in 1987, the U.S. played its very first sort of preliminary knockout to qualify for the 1988 Olympic tournament in Seoul. And this is a very obscure sort of home-and-home series in May 1987, but it's really super important. The U.S. lost the first leg 2-0 in New Brunswick, Canada, and basically came back and beat the Canadians 3-0 in St. Louis to advance. And, what happens if they don't advance? Well, the national team doesn't play maybe 20 games between May 1987 and the Olympic tournament in September 1988. that period really cemented this group as a unit. All these guys are growing up. They're playing in the urban ethnic leagues. They're playing under Lothar Osiander, international competition. The Canadians were the best team in CONCACAF, other than Mexico. They're the ones who qualified for the 1986 Mexican World Cup. They were a good side. We beat them, and then we beat everyone else on the way to qualification. And then we go to Seoul, South Korea for the Olympics, and the team just surprised everyone. The opening game, they were up 1-0 on Argentina, and John Harkes gave up a penalty in the 88th minute. So we tie that game. They should have won it. The next game, they play the hosts, South Korea, and they get another draw and played very, very well. Now, they lost the last game to the Soviet Union. They won the gold medal. It's the best team in the tournament. So they were in a very difficult group. They really should have advanced out of the group. But coming home from that tournament, it was clear that this idea, this Werner Fricker creation, this unit that he had put this faith in, they were pretty good, and they were young, and they were still getting better. And the A-League had relaunched, and now they had a place to go play. And oh, by the way, when they went to the Olympics, European sides started sniffing around and saying, this Peter Vermees guy is pretty good. There were individuals, Caligiuri, Vermees, Tab Ramos, that international talent scouts started saying, you know what? These guys aren't bad, and they're going to come really cheap. And that was sort of the entree into that was the eye-opening experience, not just for the European clubs, but for the players themselves. They basically started going abroad from that point forward. But that period between May 1987 and September 1988, huge developmental period. None of it happens if they don't beat the Canadians in that series. And again, I can't underestimate, at that point in 1987, the Canadians were one of two dominant teams in CONCACAF. It was a massive, massive win for the U.S. And if it didn't happen, I don't know that we're talking about this story today in the same way.
On July 4th, 1988, America is awarded the rights to host the 1994 World Cup.
Mm-hmm.
We come to the 1989, there's the Under-20 World Cup with Bob Gansler as manager.
Mm-hmm.
Following the Under-20 World Cup, Bob Gansler is appointed as the national team manager. Can you describe this critical phase?
Well, Lothar Osiander coached the team at the Olympics and did a tremendous job. Everyone loved the guy. He was very stern, German, taskmaster type coach. He produced results. He developed a lot of players. But when Gansler took the under-20 team to Saudi Arabia in January of 1989, I think Fricker already wanted to hire him, but he couldn't. This was Fricker's friend. They went way back. They played on the 1964 U.S. Olympic team together. They went way back. They're both of German-Hungarian stock. They are blood brothers. But they couldn't hire him because Osiander had done too good a job. Oh, and by the way, the U.S. went to the first futsal World Cup in January 1989 and came in third. So things were really going well. Well, Gansler goes to Saudi Arabia and actually gets the U.S. to the semifinals. It's still the furthest any men's team has gone in a FIFA competition. And that is the moment that Fricker seized upon and replaced Osiander with his friend Gansler. And, their first qualifier was in early April. So we're talking a couple months he had to take over the team and put his stamp on it. So he took a big chance. One of the things that is clear from studying this period is that, and Gansler, I think, is given widespread credit for it, is Gansler took a lot of chances with the people that he chose, with the guys he played in 1989, trying to qualify for the Italian World Cup. He played some guys, started some guys that you just wouldn't believe. Guys named George Pastor, who was a Peruvian national who had been naturalized and played for the Milwaukee Wave, scored about 178 8 goals for this AISA indoor team. He started a full-on qualifier for the U.S. national team in June 1989. Philip Guiao, another one I'd never heard of, started a game in June of 1989. So Gansler took a lot of chances with his guys, but so did Fricker. Fricker took a chance. He basically laid his entire reputation on the line, getting rid of a guy who had success in Osiander and hiring Gansler. But I think Gansler was a full-time employee of the Federation at that point, and Osiander never was. He was a contract employee. He still famously was the maitre d' at a fancy restaurant in San Francisco. And the legend is he didn't want to give that up. I find that hard to believe. I think the writing was on the wall that during 1988. And I think Fricker probably expected him to get his hat handed to him at the Olympics and relieve him of his duties then, but he did too well. So that period was a little different. But yeah, that's what happened. Gansler's a brand new coach taking over this team that really was attached to Lothar Osiander. He was the coach for 3 years, and these were young men who weren't getting any other coaching in a professional, setting. They were attached to him. They had success with him, and in walks Gansler, who takes over, and bingo, their first game is 10 weeks later.
Can you summarize this 1990 World Cup qualification adventure that culminated with the match at Port of Spain against Trinidad Tobago on November 1989 with the shot heard around the world?
Did you watch the $1 Billion Goal, the television series that was recently on Paramount Plus?
I haven't yet, no.
It's not bad. I thought the third episode, which covered just the Trinidad and Tobago game, was really good. But the first 2 episodes, which sort of recap everything we've talked about in 2 episodes, was very sort of surface and a lot of sort of platitudes about, sometimes when you read history or watch documentary, they keep telling you things you've already heard. There was no new reporting in that. For that, you need to read Generation Zero, fans. But I think the best way to think about 1989 was, aside from the fact that they got this brand new coach that they don't even know, is that there's really a tale of 2 halves. You split the 8-game qualification series from April to November, you can split in half. The first half could not have gone a whole lot better.
I also want to point out as background that we should mention that Mexico was disqualified from the qualification process. And
yes,
to many, that was a big advantage to the American team.
Yes, and we'll come back to that. It was not. In reality, it's one of those misconceptions that I think people just keep repeating. But Mexico was banned for using overage players. They were banned shortly after the U.S. got awarded the World Cup in 1988. Anyway, Mexico was banned from the Olympics in 88, from the 89 Saudi Under-20 World Cup, and the Senior World Cup in Italy. The first half of qualifying went very, very well. Gansler lost the first game in Costa Rica, came back and beat the Costa Ricans a week later. And then they took all the points from Guatemala and tied TNT. So 2 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. And they've played the best team, their most competitive opponent already. They've already played Costa Rica twice. So they were really in very good position. And that's the first half of qualifying. In the second half of qualifying, they won the match day 5, and I believe it was against Guatemala, in Guatemala. And then they just stopped scoring. They didn't score for basically the second half of the Guatemala game and 2 more games. They couldn't put the ball in the net. And that's why they ended up in the situation that they did on the final match day with Trinidad and Tobago, having to win instead of being able to already been qualified or maybe.
And yeah, we should point out, had they actually won one of those games, I think they would have already been qualified and not to have to rely on this match. Is that true? Or
I think that is true. I think that is true. I think that I heard Tony Meola tell me that if they had given up a single goal in any of the last 4 games, the game that they won and the 2 games that they tied, and of course the last game, so that's 4 games. If they'd given up a single goal in any of those games, they don't go to Italy. So that's how close it was. Of course, they didn't give up any goals and they didn't score any goals. So it was all razor sharp. But this was the way the entire tournament, this final qualifying tournament for CONCACAF, I think there were 18 games played, a total, or 16 of them were 1-goal games, and hardly any goal. I think the Golden Boot winner was tied amongst 8 guys who had 2. So there just weren't a lot of goals in this qualifying group. The Trinidad and Tobago finale was, what it was. It was on the knife edge. And again, I would definitely recommend watching the $1 Billion Goal. The final episode is really fun because they actually talk to the Trinidadians like I did, and they got great stories. But, it's perfect for TV, that kind of 16 different talking heads all talking about one game, one play, one goal. I thought it was well done. But you want to read Generation Zero for the entire chapter on qualifying because, man, it was a crazy, crazy 8 months. Getting used to Gansler, you just can't believe the number of guys that you've never heard of who played huge roles in the, Caligiuri didn't even play until September. He was stuck on a D2 team in East Germany, not getting minutes. They wouldn't release him. So the hero of the whole qualifying crowd didn't play. I believe he started the first game in Costa Rica, didn't come back until match day 5.
Miola, he was actually a college student at this point, and I think he became a starter like in the middle of the qualification process.
He was. The guy who started the first Costa Rican game was a fellow named Jeff Dubach. He was replaced by David Vanoli, who really was their top goalkeeper. He was the one who played very well at the Olympics. He's played at UCLA with Paul Crumpy and Paul Caligiuri. But Vanoli got hurt, I think, in the fourth in match day 4. And Miola had debuted for the senior national team in a friendly against Peru like 2 weeks before. And now all of a sudden he's the starting keeper on the national team. He's got one cap. And he's basically a sophomore at the University of Virginia. So this is where the college kids stories come from for people like that. They weren't all college kids. By 1990, a lot of them weren't in college anymore. But yeah, that was pretty crazy. Again, if you look, one of the things are you a Society of American Soccer History member? I reprinted, and with credit, of course, their game summaries from all 8 qualifiers in that chapter. And they're really amazing to look at. The number of guys that Gansler went through is astonishing, considering how thin the talent pool was, especially. He took some extraordinary chances and showed some extraordinary faith in some very, very unproven players who, after George Pastore started that game, he never played for the U.S. men's national team again. Right. So, I mean, it was a weird experience. Bruce Murray told me that because of this incredible changeover, he never felt so much pressure to hold his place on any team in his life. And this guy played all over the world because there were guys coming in all the time. They were like, Gansler was finding, strikers in the indoor league. And it's like, yeah, you're coming to camp. And Murray thinks he's a starting striker. And then 4 more guys show up that he's never seen. It was a really strange period. And also, I think it must be said that at this point, the A-League is up and running and several guys are playing abroad. They'd never really, most professionals, by the time they're playing on their national team, trying to qualify for World Cup, they've learned how to compartmentalize their club experience and their national team experience. They're getting games, with their club, maybe they're not, but they're, then they go and play for their national team. And that's more settled because, they're the best players in the country. And they're not dealing with that kind of thing that Bruce Murray was dealing with, where 5 new strikers show up because we're developing Soccer Nation and they just found them or they were just naturalized. So it was a crazy time to be a player. And I think Gansler deserves a lot of credit for making such a good go of it because it could have really gone sideways.
Getting back to this stereotype of referring to the team as a team of college kids.
Yeah.
Why do you think this tag really stuck?
Well, I think it stuck because European football writers, mainly in Italy, latched onto it and couldn't stop talking about the fact that this team, well, first of all, there was no league where these guys were playing. Some, a couple of them were playing abroad, but most of them were playing, for these A-League teams or playing indoor, in the winter. They were still doing that. And then there were some guys like Marcelo Balboa and Eric Winalda who were fresh out of San Diego State. They weren't still students there. They were actually employed by the federation. Basically, in order to join the federation and accept the money, they had to leave school. But I think Gansler tells a great story about being, in press conferences in Italy, in June 1990. And the football writers are like, so where do your players play, when they're not with the national team? And he's like, well, some of them are in school still, and some of them are playing for the A-League, and some of them are playing over here. And we call them into camps, and they come for 2 weeks, and then they go back. And basically, they didn't believe him, but he was telling the truth, and it was just a little bit too hard believe. And I think one of the great questions was also some press wag was basically, how much did the U.S. pay the Trinidad and Tobago Federation, Jack Warner, to throw that game? Because it made perfect sense to Italians that that would have been done. Of course, I don't think that was done, but they just didn't know what to make of this American team. They had never seen an American team. They had no conception of what we've been talking about, the idea that, there were no academies and that there were no clubs and that there was no league and that these guys they all went to college. No one on the Italian national team played college soccer. Nobody. I tell this story a lot. I went to school in London for a year and I played soccer for the University of London select team. And people are like, oh, well, you played soccer for the University of London. I'm like, don't be impressed. Nobody who could play soccer plays college soccer in England. If you're any good, you're playing for, Swindon Town and, in their academy. And, it's all the guys who can't play who play college soccer. So the idea to Italians that the Americans were all college products, if not actually college students, just didn't compute. And of course, they thought it was ridiculous that this team was even at the World Cup and, oh, by the way, going to be hosting the next one in 1994.
Well, this stereotype was also echoed by the American media, who were also not knowledgeable enough about the game. So maybe that had something to do with it as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that because, the American media, as dismissive as they were about American soccer, the idea of college students representing the U.S. at international competitions was something that we saw every Olympics. Every Olympic hockey team, every Olympic basketball team up until 1992 was college kids. So it made, I don't think it made that enough, that big an impression on our media. All the media here knew was that all of a sudden they were being asked to cover the sport that they didn't like and didn't know anything about. And that was really the problem, was that it felt like an infringement. It's sort of like, have you been watching the Kansas City Chiefs and all the attention that is paid to Taylor Swift at these games? It's amazing. Yeah, to hear real hardcore NFL fans and media sort of crack wise about, what is this sideshow? Why are we paying attention to Taylor Swift? What, doesn't she know that the NFL is serious business? I mean, it's sort of like that. It's like, I remember watching Sports Center in 1989 and 90, and some of the guys who were hosting, the U.S. would be playing some qualifier and they would just all over the sport. And like, this game, look, this crowd, the crowd is some sparse crowd in Guatemala. No one's there. They're making fun of that. And it's raining and the pitch is a mess. And they made fun of that. They just weren't ready to accept soccer because they were elite media gatekeepers. And I think that was something that soccer struggled with for the next 10 or 12 years, probably well into the 21st century before the media really got on board. And geez, in 1988 and 1989 and at the 1990 World Cup, they were just not ready.
Can you go over the contract dispute between the federation and the players just after qualification?
Yeah. Well, so it's November 1989. They beat Trinidad and Tobago on the Paul Caligiuri goal. And immediately, Puma comes in and signs a bunch of guys to contracts because, oh my God, this team is going to be in Italy. We want them wearing Puma. Now, Adidas and Puma have this long-standing rivalry, right? The problem was the U.S. national team was an Adidas outfitted team, head to toe. And the U.S. Soccer Federation had no money. And they were very beholden to Adidas. So Puma came in and signed all these guys. There were 10 of them. And in January at a camp, Gansler comes out and says, you got to take those shoes off. And people freaked out. And here's part of the reason they freaked out was that in December, all the guys on the team were brought to New York and basically handed contracts that there was no negotiation. They were lowball contracts that basically dared them to say, I'm not going to sign this, because who's not going to want to go to the World Cup in their place? There are plenty of people. They really played hardball with these guys on the contract front and this personal outfitting contract front. So a lot of guys are still bitter about that. To be honest, I was a little surprised at just how long. That's a long time ago. But the Federation really screwed them, and they dared them to walk out. They also paid everybody a different amount. Bruce Murray was telling me that in 1990, he's playing for, I think, Lucerne in the Swiss League. But he leaves that to come back and play for the Federation on a contract. So he got way more than Paul Crumpy did, who was playing, for an A-League club and left an A-League club to come and join the national team on the Federation payroll. So they weren't paid the same. And Bruce Murray was an Adidas contract guy, so he got paid for wearing it on top of the Adidas deal. So he thought he made six figures in 1990, but that was the top end. Other guys were making 30 or 40 grand, and not terrible money in 1990, but not good money either. So I think that all the guys felt that the Federation had said, we're going to take care of you if you qualify. And then they did qualify, and they didn't exactly take care of them. So that's what all went down between December and March of 1990. And it was not great for team morale, which was really, as far as Gansler was concerned, the one thing they really had going for them. So that really pulled the team apart a little bit. But, in other ways, I thought the Federation did a pretty good job. I think they assembled a schedule of 13 friendlies, good friendlies, against solid European teams, Switzerland, Poland, East Germany, Colombia. There were some patsies, but there were some good. They lost a lot of games, but they did pretty good. I think that one of the things that I think revelations that I remember discovering and researching this book was just how infrequently the U.S. men's national team played actual matches, not just qualifiers, but friendlies. Nobody played us because there was absolutely nothing in it for a good soccer nation to play the United States from about all through the 90s until we got named host of the World Cup. Then people were like, oh, well, we're going to be going over there to play the World Cup in 94. Let's go play. Let's go check it out and see what Orlando is like. We'll go to Disney World afterwards. But Brian Bliss, who was a full-on national team player from about 1984 to 1993, I think he retired with 44 caps. I mean, do the math. That is not a lot of games. I mean, Kobe Jones played like 150 games for the U.S. Nobody played us. And when they did get a game, it was CONCACAF because they had to play us. They played Colombian clubs. They played Liechtenstein. I think after they got booted from, they failed to qualify for the 1982 World Cup, and they fired Walt Chisowich, who was the national team manager. And I think the national team went 14 months without playing a single game, or maybe one game against Trinidad and Tobago. Can you imagine the national team not playing a game for 14 months?
Do you remember those Marlboro Cups?
Yes.
They were usually against, I would say, I think Colombian club sides.
Those I think that they played a Marlboro Cup before qualifying started in April 1989. Those were the only competitive matches that Gansler presided over before they started qualifying. Imagine that. They name a new coach, and there's not a single competitive friendly against another nation played, before you start qualifying for the World Cup that you have to qualify for to to basically redeem FIFA's choice of giving you the 1994 World Cup. And that's a whole other, aspect. But I think that in 1986, when Osiander took over, he played two friendlies in January and February of 1986. The U.S. didn't play another competitive match until that Canadian home and home in May of 1987. I mean, that's 15 months. It's, you're building a young national team. You get them some games. Couldn't do it. Nobody wanted to come and play. They didn't have the money to send them anywhere to play. We talked about the culture in this country, and it was not made any better by the fact that the rest of the world just had no time for us as a soccer nation. There was no money, no television. The only thing we had were great stadiums, but no one was going to be in the stadiums if you host a game, in the Orange Bowl. So yeah, it was a crazy time.
Let's get to the World Cup.
Yeah.
There are three matches. The first one against Czechoslovakia is a disaster. 1-5 loss. There's redemption against the hosts Italy with only a 1-0 loss, where Bob Gansler does a tactical switch and installs John Doyle and Jimmy Banks and Marcelo Balboa into the lineup.
Mhm.
And then the last match against Austria that was inconsequential for both teams at this point, I believe, and is just a yellow card, red card, not a very good match to watch. That was America's return to the World Cup after 40 years.
Mhm.
I guess at the time it was just seen as an educational process.
Sure. And I think that's fair. The guys on the team had higher expectations than that. They really thought they could get something from the Austria game. I think that's the one that hurt. I mean, they played two of those games. They got a guy, they got Winalda thrown out in
Against Czechoslovakia, that's right.
against
Yeah.
Czechoslovakia, and Winalda's like 19 or 20 years old. And apparently Gansler told him, they're baiting you. They're baiting you. They're trying to get you thrown out. Be careful. And Wells like, yeah. 10 minutes later, right after halftime, boom, he's gone. So that game got out of hand, but it wasn't necessarily out of hand when he got thrown off. I think it was 3-1. So Austria, that's a game they all felt they should have won. At that point, they had just come off the game against Italy. They were feeling their oats. The Austrians got a guy thrown out.
Yes, Peter Artner was sent off. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that game, when you hear them talk, I watched it. I guess my own memory was I was just overwhelmed with how awesome it was to watch an American national team play a meaningful match at a World Cup. I mean, it was just an amazing experience. I was all tingly and nervous in a way I just wasn't, like watching the Celtics play an NBA Finals game. It was just different. But for these guys, they really felt like they had a chance to redeem their place at this tournament against Austria, and they all showed and admitted just how naive and tactically they were. Because when a good team is playing an opponent that is, gone down to 10 men, you have to have patience and you have to have confidence in your own ability to hold the ball and knock it around and wait, for your opportunity and score. Well, not only could they not do that, they gave up 2 goals to Austria on counters. They lost to a 10-man team on 2 counters and ended up scoring a late goal to make it respectable. But I thought of all the games, including the Czech game, they showed their naivete against Austria. They knew it. But what are you going to do? They learned their lessons. And what really mattered, I think, for U.S. soccer was that I think a dozen of those guys ended up playing in Europe. That just simply would not have happened if it weren't for the shop window of the Italian World Cup. We don't really get that, and we can talk about this. Americans are still learning about international sport, but the market for soccer is greatest in Europe. And if you play in a World Cup, you are automatically marketable. Brian Bliss played 15 minutes in the Austria game, and he is convinced that is what got him signed to the East German team later that year. Without those 15 minutes, they would not have called him in. Now, 15 minutes, at the end of the last game, a meaningless World Cup game, it sounds like it would never make a difference to an employing club. It made all the difference. All those guys went and played at the level they had all dreamed about playing because of that experience. So I think they would have much rather won a game or stolen a point from somebody. It didn't happen, and they have to live with it. But they're not going to complain because I think it all worked out pretty well for them.
Let's go back to your original premise. Why do you think this Generation Zero is overshadowed by the 1994 experience?
Well, I think it's hard for people who don't understand football as well as others might, in other countries, to understand that the development of this generation of players and fans took 20 years' time. And I don't think that's really been written about before Generation Zero was published. Americans seem to think that they can host a tournament and that's going to change the culture. And that's just not the way it works. So I think people are really unable to think of it as this long timeline beginning with the youth soccer revolution. And so that's part of the reason they say, oh, well, the 94 World Cup happened and all of a sudden we were a soccer nation and MLS started and we were away we go. But USA 94 was a great success, but the ball had already gotten started rolling. I think the best argument is, look, there's 11 guys on the field in 1994. 6 of them are veterans of the 1990 team. And if you don't naturalize Tom Dooley and Roy Wegerle, it would be higher than that. So the on-field component was still the core of that team was Bob Gansler's 1990 team, and they were 4 years older and better in 1994. So I still go back to 1990 as the turning point. That is the group of people that made it change. But I think we talked about it. 1994 set all sorts of records for attendance. That doesn't happen without Generation Zero filling those stadiums. These are all people that were raised on soccer. They knew it. They didn't have to be, it wasn't like a lark. They went and filled those stadiums because they knew enough to go and watch a World Cup match because it was in their country. I think, too, that for whatever reason, there are some media figures that came off that 1994 team that ended up being quite influential. Alexi Lalas is the best example. Kobe Jones is another one. Ernie Stewart, probably the most accomplished executive turned out by American soccer. These guys all played on the 1994 team. I think the most fun theory was advanced by several players that I spoke to, and this was a surprise to me. They think that the Federation doesn't promote the 1990 team because it was an Adidas team. And that because Nike is the outfitter now, Nike really has no interest in talking about that tournament and showing pictures of those uniforms and that team the way they would if they were wearing Nike. I was like, really? Brand consciousness is that strong? But I mean, 3 or 4 guys said that to me. So I think there's something to it. They were there. That's one of those inside sort of baseball things that I'm just going to bow to that view because I was not there.
Yeah, that seems strange though, because in 1994 they were still under Adidas, weren't they?
Yeah, and isn't it weird how those uniforms, I didn't like them. I'm not going to say I did, but that's become part of the narrative as well.
They didn't like it. However, they're considered classics now. For a lot of for a lot of kit collectors, yeah, they become classics, believe it or not. Yeah.
I heard Tony Meola told me that no one liked them at the time.
Soccer America certainly didn't like it. They voted as the worst uniform of all the teams.
They made it plain to the team that, look, these are our partners, and you guys have got to talk about how awesome they are. Right before the tournament, they were given an Adidas like garment bag with all their uniforms in it, and they said, make sure to check the top pocket of the garment bag. They paid each of those guys $10,000, basically to shut them up. It was hush money. We'll get better uniforms for the next World Cup. But the premise about 94, I think, is just the easy way out. And MLS started so closely afterwards. They sort of go together in the American soccer consciousness. But I'm going to stick with the premise because the 94 team the core of it was 1990. And hosting a tournament, a lot of people don't think that if we didn't qualify for 1990, FIFA might have pulled the World Cup from the United States.
That theory I had not heard, but yeah, so that was new to me when I read it.
So one of the things that, and I talked about it earlier when we were discussing things that the players thought that I hadn't thought of. And, sometimes players know more than the average Joe, and sometimes they're just young and wrong. But, when I first started talking about this idea that FIFA, that they were really singing for their supper, that it was really important for the U.S. to qualify for 1990, or else they don't get the World Cup in 1994. There's certainly no proof of it anywhere because FIFA is very good at covering their tracks, and the Federation has no interest in advancing that idea. And they did qualify. So it's sort of a false positive. But I talked to a dozen of these guys. Every single one of the players feels that FIFA would have done that, and that the Federation made it clear to them in so many words over the course of 2 years that they were playing for the 94 World Cup bid. Make no mistake. And when you hear that from so many players who were there, it's hard not to put some stock in it. And I think that FIFA was way more interested in the American market from a money standpoint. I don't think they cared whether or not the U.S. grew into a soccer nation. Now it has grown into a soccer nation. And I think the 2026 World Cup is going to be an amazing event. But at the time, FIFA had never awarded a World Cup on that basis. They had pulled a World Cup from Colombia, but Colombia was in the midst of a drug-fueled civil war, and they said, "Oh, they don't have enough stadiums." I'm like, I don't think that's really what it was about. But the idea of awarding a World Cup on the basis of trying to seed new ground in the world soccer market had never been done. Now we've seen it done since, bringing the World Cup to South Africa in 2010, bringing the World Cup to Qatar in 2022. This is something that FIFA has done more than once, and I think that the U.S. probably could have lost that Trinidad and Tobago game and still held on to the World Cup. But as everyone told me, all the players and all the administrators I spoke to, if they had lost, it would have looked so bad. I mean, it would have given everything that came after such a terrible ring to it. And it worked out. It worked out. I mean, this is why we really should hold up this team. That team had no business qualifying for the World Cup. They did it anyway. There was no league here. They were all, they hadn't played in any proper soccer anywhere in the world for the most part, and they stole it. They could have qualified earlier if they could score some goals in Guatemala, but they left it to the end, and then they came good. So I think they get the credit. But that's another example. The Mexico being just qualified and not being involved in qualifying in 1990. That was another example of sometimes you put stock in what the primary sources say, and other times you don't. I couldn't tell you how many guys, players on the 1989 U.S. MNT, who said to me, "Well, Mexico wasn't there, so we had that going for us." Well, Mexico was banned like July 1, 1988. We were awarded the World Cup July 4, 1988. So that looked bad. It looked like FIFA was trying to help us. But by that time, the CONCACAF qualifying had already been mapped out. And there was a home and home playoff that basically formed the group of 5 final qualifiers, right? So the U.S. played Jamaica home and home. The winner went to the final qualifying group in April 1989. Guatemala actually beat Canada in that home and home. And Canada was maybe the second best team in CONCACAF at that time. So Mexico was already slated to play a play-in against Costa Rica. Now, these are arguably the 2 best teams in the region. So if there was a fix, it was that they were playing each other. And one of them was never going to play in final qualifying and threatened to knock the U.S. out. In that way, yes, Mexico being out of the tournament helped the U.S. But either Costa Rica or Mexico was going to be out. The fact that Mexico was the team that was out still meant that Costa Rica was the one team that was going to come from that playoff. So it really made no difference. The either Mexico or Costa Rica maybe would have finished first in the group, but there was never going to be both of them in the final qualifying. CONCACAF saw to that, and if you want to argue that FIFA paid them to set that up, I wouldn't doubt it.
Let's discuss this team's manager, Bob Gansler, and his importance in developing this team. You mentioned all the players that he called up and how he molded this team of young players. I remember in an interview, he called this generation or this team, he said that they were pioneers. Do you think, as far as U.S. soccer growth is concerned, this group, along with Bob Gansler, will be regarded as pioneers, or they will only just be known to football historians?
I don't know. I mean, they were clearly pioneers. Gansler was a fascinating character, and a complicated character. I talked to him twice. He's really smart, but he's also not a sentimentalist. So I kept on trying to get him to talk about why earlier teams, in 1985, and when he was playing, his U.S. national team had a chance to qualify in 1969 for the Mexican World Cup in 1970, and they lost to Haiti. They came close a couple of times. But he steadfastly refuses to say, yeah, we really should have qualified back then. What he kept saying to me was, we did what we could at that point in time. Every year we got a little better and we were able to do a little more. So he's like, I'm not into this big boom Hollywood type attitude. He refuses to think that way. He also said to me that, he played in the very earliest days of MLS. he was a pioneer. These guys were really staking out new ground for the Chicago Mustangs in 1968. But he said, we were pioneers, but we weren't like trying to do anything for US soccer. We were trying to do things for ourselves. We wanted to succeed. We wanted to play a better brand of soccer in this country and then maybe go play somewhere else. In Europe, they had dreams like anyone else did. So I thought he had a really, really grounded way of thinking about it. He never allowed himself or his players to get wrapped up in this idea of being pioneers. They were obviously pioneers, but they weren't playing to make history. They were playing to go play in a World Cup because that's what players want to do. He understood that. And he understood that if they were able to go, it would make his reputation, it would make the reputation of all of his players and earn them the right to play in Hungary and Sweden and Spain like they did play because they did go to that World Cup. He understood that. And he understood that the Federation needed him to get this done, and his friend Werner Fricker had hired him to do it, and he took care of it. He's a very severe and no-nonsense guy. I don't know. I really think that he's one of those guys. You ever, talk about playing for the shirt? He really did mean that. He felt these guys should be playing for the shirt because they're all in it together, but not because they're going to have some Hollywood ending and some guy named Hal is going to write a book about me in 2022. They did it because that's what soccer's about at the international level. It's about being better than the last World Cup team. It's about going further. It's about the way people talk about it today. They're like, what would be success in 2026? I think people sort of generally agree that the U.S. could maybe go to a semifinal. That would be going a little further. That's what he believes. He's an evolutionarian. He believes soccer works that way. That's the way the history of soccer in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is framed for him. That fits in with, I think, the history for a large part. But there are other ways that, I was trying to get him to talk about things that I thought would make a better story, but he was pretty much having none of that. So I respect Bob. I think the players really respected him, and I think they really love him now. I mean, I think looking back, I'm 59, which means that all these guys on this team are 59. That was the conceit of the book. These are the same. They're all the same age as me. They had the same history as me. If you had a great coach when you were 19 years old, and oh, by the way, he qualified you for a World Cup, you're going to love that guy forever. And they love this guy.
In closing, what was the biggest surprise that you learned in writing and researching this book?
Well, I think we talked about it. I think it was this idea that there were these cool bits of history that I did uncover. And sometimes the players knew that history, and sometimes they didn't. I just sort of assumed that they would know, that Mexico's ban really didn't help them at all. But they didn't. I assumed that they would know that FIFA had come to the federation and said, you got to qualify or else you're not going to get the 94 World Cup. But I couldn't prove that. And Mike Watala at Soccer America told me that he's been looking into this for 10 years. He can't prove it. There's no proof. But it just surprised me that the guys who were on the ground in the middle of the fray sometimes didn't have it right. They don't remember it in the same way as their friends did, on the team. And I guess that makes sense because life is like that. This book has resulted in sort of, I'm getting together with a lot of guys I played with growing up. And we've gotten together for dinners. And man, it's just amazing to hear people talk about things that I remember, and they just remember them completely differently. So it's hard to get a narrative down on paper that everyone is going to agree with. But just the people that you think are going to be able to sort that out for you doesn't always happen. But the other one that I remember, but I ended up really reporting it out, was that period in 1987 before the A-League had relaunched. Really was the heyday of indoor soccer in this country. And there was a brief moment in the late 80s when I think a lot of American culture had given up on soccer, and the major networks had given up on it, then forgotten about it years ago. And ESPN is like running indoor soccer matches from MISL. And there was a moment when people said, you know what? Maybe indoor soccer is the brand of soccer that this country is going to latch onto, because they're clearly not going to latch onto the outdoor game. We know that. And I remember I was in my competitive prime there. I was playing for one of those urban ethnic clubs. And I had that feeling. There was no, there was no overriding sort of optimism that things were going to pop. If we can just qualify for the World Cup. Before they awarded us the World Cup, there was nobody thinking that. I can tell you, I was there. And a lot of people thought that, this indoor soccer thing is great on television. It's a lot faster. There's a lot more goals. You can put commercials in. It just suits Americans better. So I thought it was interesting to talk to people about that, because I remember it. And I'm just glad we were so wrong.
Well, with that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter, he's at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. The links to Mr. Phillips' book and his other links have also been included on the podcast and blog uploads. So, Mr. Phillips, thank you again. This was an enjoyable discussion on history of American soccer.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was really fun.
Thank you.